500. 400. 300. 100 above. 200. Minimum. 100.
Straight down the road.
50. 40. 30. 20. Retard. 9.
Today's episode is proudly brought to you by Airline Leather. Airline Leather is an artisanal leather goods company that only uses the highest quality materials like full-grain local leather and braided polyester thread from Germany. All items are handcrafted in their modest garage workshop in Pretoria, South Africa. You can find them on their Facebook page, Airline Leather, or click on the link below. Mention High Performance Teams for your 20% discount. Good afternoon to you. Welcome. Today, my guest is a highly accomplished aviator, leader, and mentor. Captain Colin Jordaan was the director, the commissioner, the chief executive officer of the South African Civil Aviation Authority. He was the former general manager of flight operations at South African Airways, and he currently sits on the board at Comair Limited. He's a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, and he is also an all-round nice guy and easy to talk to. I'm looking forward to this conversation. My name is Alex McPhail, and this is High Performance Teams. Colin, good day. Welcome to you. How are you doing in this freezing day in Joburg?
I'm in Cape Town, but it's cold here as well. Doing well, Alex.
Well, I didn't get that all the research all done properly. I just assumed you were up here. We were talking about how cold it was earlier. I'm freezing today. I got a blanket on my legs, but I do have pants on, and I'm ready for this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Colin. I appreciate your time.
A real pleasure.
Colin, I want to just go back to the sort of the early days, the formative years. You know, sort of as a youth, as an elderly teenager, as it were. You have this aspiration of flying. Where did that all start? Where did the flying bug bite for you?
It's a little bit weird, actually. I was always keen on airplanes. We used to build these model airplanes and play fighters and bombers and all the rest of the stuff when I was young. My mother's first husband was a bomber pilot in the Second World War and was shot down and killed, unfortunately. So she asked us never to join the Air Force. One thing that she asked us not to do. She said, you can do whatever you like in your career. Please don't join the Air Force. So that avenue was out. I went to university at Wits University, and eventually Dennis Spence, who is well known to most South African aviators, convinced me to do aeronautical engineering. I started doing mechanical, and we switched over to aeronautical. And he got me interested in flying, and together we created the Wits University Flying Association and conned the university into giving us money to buy an airplane. Which was quite something at the time.
That sounds like a good story. Was he also a student at the time?
Yeah. We were both studying aeronautical engineering, that's correct. And so the Wits University Flying Club had been going for a while, but we bought this plane. And in fact, we paid the university back within 1 year. and we charged our students 12 Rand solo and 18 Rand dual.
So back in the day. Wow.
Back in the day. And after we paid it back in a year, they gave us some more money, and we bought a Piper Arrow, an advanced trainer with retractable gear and variable pitch propeller. And that we operated for a number of years. It was involved in a crash at night time.
Okay.
And then we got another one, which is an upgrade to the first one. And the Wits University Flying Club is still going to this day.
Oh, wonderful. That's a good start to the story. And then obviously you carried on studying at the same time. Did you finish up your aeronautical engineering?
So I was putting myself through university at the time, which was, I had to work a bit and study a bit, work a bit. So it was taking me 2 years for every year. But eventually in 1977, I got my Springbok colors to go to the World Precision Flying Championships in Austria.
Okay.
And I was recently married, and so I took my wife along and blew quite a lot of the money I'd saved for my final year. But spent the whole flight going via Lisbon and Zurich to Vienna in the cockpit of the 747 SP. And when I got to Vienna airport, I said to my wife, I know what it is that I want to do with my life. I want to be an airline pilot at SA. And so I cancelled my final year, having completed 3 years. Mm-hmm. And went on to then, I was doing my commercial license, got my instructors, all the rest of the stuff. And eventually, about 2.5 years later, got into SAA as a junior first officer.
Okay, well,
it was the beginning of 1980.
Well, we won't say the rest is history because there's so much more that's going to come, and we're going to zoom in into lots of sort of key points along the way. But I can remember I was having a conversation with someone else this morning, and as a child, my father had moved to the UK. I was living in Cape Town, and in the June-July holidays, the agreement was that while he was abroad for a number of years, that my sister and I would get to travel, and we would go and visit him in the UK. And in the school holidays, and I flew with SAA, and there's a very good chance that some of the people that I currently, well, maybe not now, but when I joined SAA 12 years ago, I'll be flying with some of those same people that were flying on that UK route in the sort of mid to late 80s, and they were just reminiscing about that, and certainly those tasters of those early days of experiencing airline flying, the bug does bite, and it bites hard. So you get into SAA and you settle in just like most airline guys. It take a while to just find your feet and enjoy this new job and traveling the world and new responsibilities, etc. But it's one of those points that you can discuss probably at length, but just in a sort of a shortened version of it. There's lots of different opportunities that anyone can get involved in when you're in an airline. You're a pilot, but there's little projects, there's training, there's safety, there's lecturing, ground lectures, there's the union side of things. So tell me what first grabbed your attention to get stuck in and do more than just fly airplanes for the airline.
Well, it was in my very first year. At that stage, I was a junior first officer, third pilot, or boy pilot as we called it in those days. And because of my engineering background, I was invited to join the SAPA technical team. And in June 1980, attended the Aircraft Design and Operations Committee of IFALPA, the International Federation of Airline Pilots. They had a meeting in Johannesburg, and I was appointed by SAPA then to join this committee.
Okay.
And I did that for many years. Eventually became the technical director of SAPA, the Pilots Association. And got to do amazing things, got to go to amazing places, besides the fact that I'd been flying. I got, for example, invited to be on the IFALPA fly-by-wire committee in the early 80s, and got to go to Toulouse and fly the A320 development simulator.
Oh, wow.
Long before the aircraft actually was produced, and attended a number of seminars worldwide in meetings with Airbus, in which we had I think a very significant influence on the design of the 320. At the time, Airbus was looking to have an airplane which was always controlled by a computer, that the pilots could never get direct control. And if you realize that in the early 80s, PCs haven't even really been invented, We just thought this was a little bit too far to go, and to this day, that's the situation.
Sure.
Airbus's motivation or objective with that is to get to a point where if you can reduce pilot inputs into overstressing the aircraft, they could then apply to have the design criteria reduced, and thereby making an airplane that's a lot lighter, a hell of a lot more efficient, because the killer of any aircraft design is weight. And so if they had achieved that goal back then, it would have been an absolute winner for them. They would have been able to sell aircraft and produce aircraft that had an amazing performance for the particular weight category they were in. But as pilots, we felt it was unacceptable. We always needed to have the ability to have direct control by disconnecting the computers, and that technology is still in the 320, the 330, the 340, the 380, and the 350, the newest 350.
Okay, yeah. So I mean,
it was very exciting.
Exciting. It must have been amazing in the sort of 80s to be involved in that kind of thing. If I just think about the current way, I mean, I've just recently done my training on the 350. It's very clever. It's very sophisticated, and it is fun to fly. Lots of redundancies. I can't imagine going back 30 plus years on that computer technology and making it more sort of aeroplane run or driven than it is already at the moment. Colin, I want to just step off this for a minute. I think we could have a whole discussion on that, but I want to get to the meat of the conversation. And so you realize at this point in your career that you can have a bit more influence than just be the guy who flies the plane. I say that very loosely because it is a great job as an airline pilot, but you can do more and you can apply yourself. And certainly having done many years at the university, aeronautical engineering is not some basic course either. So quickly, you establish yourself as a hard worker and a person that get things done, and you get involved in negotiations. I know it was a very critical time, but talk me through that sort of time period and the team around you, or the team that you were part of, in negotiating that, bringing South African Airways onto the world stage as far as world's best practices, seniority lists, etc., and those principles that still are in place today.
Yes, Alex. So in attending all of these conferences and meeting up with international pilots and pilots from all airlines from around the world, not only me, but the other colleagues in SAPA as well, attending the annual pilots conferences somewhere in the world, we realized that we were far behind other pilots in terms of remuneration and benefits. So Captain Blake Flemington, who was famous for being the first and only SAA captain to be hijacked in a 727 way back, he became the chairman of SAPA, and he decided to go for an industrial push. And Blake, not being, those of you that knew him or know him, will know that there was nothing shy about Blake. And
he
said, my goal is to get a 100% pay increase for the pilots.
nice lofty goal.
No, very lofty goal. And get the right to negotiate directly with our employer, South African Airways, on our terms and conditions of service. Mm-hmm. Now, at the time, unions weren't allowed, even back then, and we were represented in a sort of a consultative forum in the South African Transport Services, which was known back then. We were represented by the Footplate Association, so basically the train drivers. And so we put together this campaign. We did international salary surveys. We applied purchasing power parity so that it wasn't just based on we trying to get the same number of US dollars as they get. Mm-hmm. But I did this international survey, I think, of about 30 airlines around the world. And we did this comparison and then worked out how we were going to get to a point where we could negotiate with the company directly. And it took about a year and a half. With a lot of strategy. The company wasn't really interested at that point in time. So we managed to get some journalists on our side. And basically, through public pressure, brought South African Airways, Transport Services, and the Minister of Transport, who was our big boss in those days, around the same table in Cape Town. And there were 5 of us that were involved in the negotiations. Captain Blake Flemington, they were all captains except for myself. I was still a co-pilot back then. Captain de Villiers Steyn, Captain Ian Domisser, and Captain Piet Snyman. And we horse traded in the minister's office in Cape Town. And eventually he granted us the right to negotiate our conditions of service and to look at a salary increase. And that happened in the early part of 1988. And what happened, first of all, is that from our SAPA members, we got together 3 teams. We all looked at contracts, pilots' contracts from Swiss Air, United Airlines, Cathay Pacific, Qantas. And the 3 teams then looked at these contracts and took what they thought was appropriate out of them. And we each came up with 3 versions of what became the regulating agreement. Okay. We then sat down the 3 teams and then put that into one single version, which we used as the basis for negotiating with the company. For about 4 months, every day, we negotiated, the 5 of us, with a management team that I think had about 7 people on it, and eventually agreed page by page by page to the regulating agreement that was then signed later that year, or in the middle of that year. And I think it's important to mention right now, in the context of the South African situation, that every single airline that we surveyed had a seniority system in place, which is what we put in place back in 1988 as well. We had a sort of a seniority system back then, but it wasn't clearly defined.
Okay.
And the reason airlines have a seniority system is that as an airline pilot, you only have a job for 6 months. Every 6 months you go through a retesting of your skills. You need to pass your license every year and your instrument rating every 6 months. In those days, if you're over 40, you're doing a medical every 6 months as well. So basically, as an airline pilot, you're either competent or you're not. If you're not competent, you don't have a job. So airlines find it impossible to say pilot A is better than pilot B. Therefore, he must get promoted ahead of pilot B. It just doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that anywhere in the world, and that's why the seniority system exists. And we had an SAA. In '94, we had a system whereby pilots that could have got into SAA because of their qualification, so we talk about females and non-white male pilots, they came in on an accelerated basis. So their seniority slotted in, not at the very bottom as it usually would happen, but slotted in further up based on the date of their commercial license. So that's the background to the seniority system.
Okay.
And so
yeah, carry on.
Yeah. No. So that's regulated agreement lasted us very, very well. It was renegotiated again, I think, in '91 on minor items. But the basis of it was that SA pilots would never strike. We took out the right to strike. In fact, we agreed to take out the right to strike, and that we would settle our disputes through mediation and then arbitration, and it would be binding arbitration.
Okay.
And it was only when, in '91, when the Labour Relations Act was brought in and unions, we had to form a union, which was then LPSA, and then SAPA became part of LPSA, that in fact we were forced to put the right to strike back in. But as you know, South African Airways pilots have never gone on strike, and hopefully they never will have to.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's
assuming they're likely to.
It's a nice background to the story, and just to fill in the people that are listening and are not very familiar with the seniority list. It governs everything. It governs when you can take leave, what fleet you can be on, what routes what flight you bid for, request each month, all sorts of things. When you can get promoted. So it really is the bedrock of everything, and it is the sort of the most fairest world's best practice system, and you know, a great achievement to get that incorporated in South African Airways, and it is still what we use today. So what really want to highlight there is the lessons learned. So you went out with the team and you guys upskilled yourselves in negotiation, and that's a skill that stayed with you throughout, because now you've made a name for yourself in SAPA, and we're going to fast forward a number of years now, but eventually you work your way up and you are now the general manager of flight operations, the most senior position for a pilot at South African Airways, and in fact the first pilot to actually sit on the executive committee of the company. So talk me through your team, or your approach to your team at that point, and knowing that this is the pilot's on the Exco, and who did you surround yourself with then, and how did you execute on projects at that level?
So at that stage, when I was invited to join the Exco by the CEO, Colin Jordaan, I was the chief technical pilot. We had Johnny Woods as the chief line pilot, and Brett Keevers was the chief training captain. So I was invited to join the Exco, and it was quite an eye-opener. At that time when I joined, the Exco of SA was not very effective. SA was losing money hand over fist. But from a flight operations perspective, that was our team. And we, even back then, introduced the principle of Kaizen, which is gradual, small improvements continually. So, you know, you can't reinvent airline flying. It's been around for a long time. But what you can do is, in your particular field, whether it be in training or technical side or the actual line operations side, your team, if they have the right tools and the right training, can look at ways of improving small aspects of the operation all the time. To put those in place after discussing it with either the individual grouping of teams or at a high level of management in flight operations, put the ideas into place, and then you observe what the effect is, and hopefully what you've done results in better efficiency, because efficiency in an airline is absolute paramount. You know, the returns on investment are so small, even for a good airline. Return on ROI, return on investment, is 2 to 3%. And I mean, I would never invest in a company with an ROI of 2 to 3%.
Yeah.
And we talk about airlines like Singapore and British Airways and Lufthansa. So we'll discount the Middle East airlines because they have a totally different financial model and the way they work.
Sure. But I like that principle of Kaizen. I know it was very popular in the 80s, and that's gone through, and I share the principle of incremental gains, which is really the same thing in a different wrapper. But this continuously proving, so the way I see it breaking down is in 3 steps. There's thorough preparation, there's execution with precision, and then there's review. What was this process of review like, working with such a sort of senior management team? I mean, how do you go about reviewing? Is there something in particular? I know you mentioned the costs for running away, and you drastically try to get on top of that. And I think headcount was the thing that stood out at the time. How do you review decisions that you've made in such a big organization?
Well, there are 2 aspects to that. One was efficiency within flight operations, and for example, on the flight technical side, just by changing a routing to go to London through more Angolan airspace, we saved 10 million rand a year just by a simple change in routing. That way you can measure a lot of things. You can look at efficiency in the way that you roster your crews, in the way that you apply your flight and duty scheme to its maximum efficiency. But then in the Exco of SAA, in 2006, we lost a huge amount of money, and we were losing, as I said before, even when I joined the Exco in 2005. And as an executive team, we decided that we had to do something drastic. And in my many years, or 11 years previous previously in flight operations management, I'd been, I'm going to say the word, subjected to consultants like SH&E and various other ones, and Bain and Company, and absolutely no resultant improvement in the way things were done. And then we heard of a company called Seabury, Australian company, and we got them in to do a proposal to the executive, and we liked what they were telling us, and we put that in place. And at the time, SA had about 10,500 employees in technical and the various divisions that it has, which was way too high. And so our first step was to reduce management across the board by 25%, which actually was we could have gone a lot further, to be honest. But that was a start.
Can I just ask you
And
there
then
can I just interrupt for a
Yes.
sec? Sorry, Colin. Why did you start with management? That's interesting.
Well, that was on the advice of Seabury. They said, you can't ask your employees to do things and to look at moving on to different jobs and taking voluntary severance packages unless you're prepared to do it yourself.
Okay.
So that was critical, and we found it was critical because by the time that we went to the unions to negotiate voluntary severance packages and a reduction in staff, and our goal was 25% plus. They couldn't turn around to us and say, but yes, you're not reducing management. It was critical in the whole process. And we did. By the end of 2007, early 2008, we reduced the headcount down to approximately 8,000 people. And it was at this stage that I went to the CAA, which is then the second part of my career. But in the years while I was at the CAA, SA operated profitably for 3 years, as long as the headcount stayed down. But then, eventually, after about 2010, which is more or less the time that I came back at the beginning of 2011 to SAA. They had pushed the numbers back up to 10,500, 11,000 again, and an operating profit of 600 million rand, approximately, let's say, was turned into a loss of nearly 1 billion within 12 months. And the only thing that really changed over that period in time was the headcount. So, in all the submissions that SAPA has made to the Minister Plovin Gordon, in the run-up to where SA is right now, that headcount story has been at the core because it's proven. We proved that if you reduce the headcount, you reduce the costs.
Sure.
But unfortunately, the government, and when I was at the CA, I had the same pressures. The government had promised the electorate that they were going to create 500,000 jobs. So every CEO reporting to their boards in every government organization was under pressure to increase their headcount. And so that went into your performance management. Even at the CAA, I had pressure to increase my headcount. And so I'm not blaming the CEOs that followed in 2010, 11 and onwards directly for the problem. But, it's extremely difficult. In fact, it's impossible to run an airline with such small margins based on the wrong headcount. It's just absolutely impossible.
Okay, so you've mentioned the next step here. You've kind of jumped the gun on me a little bit there. I want to just put this little video clip up for people to see, this water salute video that you shared with me. Tell us your thoughts after.
Ladies and gentlemen, as is custom with the last flight in South African Airways, we see that our engines out. Another round for them.
Colin, that was your first final flight with South African Airways and flying with Captain Les Val, the fleet captain of the long-range fleet at the time. Tell us about this story. You head off on a flight to Washington together, and having already been appointed as the CEO of the Civil Aviation Authority. Tell us about the end of this flight.
So, yes, this whole thing happened rather quickly. I was asked by the Minister of Transport, Honourable Jeff Radebe back then, to head up the CAA, to take over as Commissioner and CEO. He actually combined the two positions previously held by two separate individuals. But that was a world best practice, ICAO world best practice. And he asked me to take up this combined position. But we had literally days in which to get this all done. And so I swapped out my London flight for this Washington flight so that I could take over the aircraft in Dakar with the minister on board and his whole team that was on the way to Washington to meet the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, and the US Department of Transportation. And I'd been negotiating with SA on my unpaid leave and exactly how it would work. And I really got final confirmation when I was sitting in Dakar that they were okay with this. So when I walked on board the airplane, I introduced myself to the minister. I'd never met him before. And I said, we're a go. It's all okay. So when we got to Washington, he got me to sign on as CEO. And the commissioner part, we have to wait until I signed off my last flight at SA, which was after that final flight in the shower that you saw back then. So I was presented in Washington to the FAA and the US Department of Transportation as the new CEO/Commissioner of the CAA. And the reason for the urgency is that earlier in that year, in August of 2007, the South African CAA, Civil Aviation Authority, had audits by ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the FAA. And there were significant findings in both of the audits. So the FAA one was a lot more critical because the organization only gets 45 days to put in place corrective action plans.
Okay.
Before a re-audit was due to happen on the 19th of December. So that final flight that you saw me taxiing in was the 14th of December. But I had been working with the Department of Transport and individuals there on how to get this second audit done in such a way that we could retain our Category 1 status in the United States. And this was incredibly important for South African Airways because if we failed that re-audit, we would have been downgraded to Category 2 status. And that would have meant virtually the end of our code share with United Airlines. In fact, it would have, because they're not allowed to code share with a Category 2 country. And our North American route would have been devastated. So from South African Airways' perspective, I had a really big motivation to be involved in trying to solve this problem. Mm-hmm. And then also, it was very important for the government to ensure that we didn't get the Category 2 status because Europe was likely to follow. And you must understand, this was in the run-up to the World Cup 2010. This was 2.5 years before World Cup 2010 took place, the Soccer World Cup. And we presented the plans that had been drawn up by the CAA and the team at the CAA. We presented the plans to Washington. And they said they would have a look at it. And when they arrived on the 19th of December, they would then give us an indication of what the situation was. But obviously, we'd go through a re-audit. So working with two individuals in particular at the Department of Transport, and I'm going to name in particular Anwar Ghani, who was the Director of Civil Aviation then at the Department of Transport. We put together a strategy of how we were going to convince these FAA inspectors that we had done enough work on our corrective action plans that they would not downgrade us. And so we put together the plan, in fact, while we were on the flight and while we were in Washington and discussing it with the minister as well. So when we came back on the 14th, I sat immediately with the team of top people at the CAA, and we discussed how we were going to ensure that we passed the re-audit on the 19th. Doing a lot of things differently that had been done in the first audit, and also making sure that we had all of the information available to the audit team right there on the spot. So they arrived on the 19th.
5 days.
Our team, I think, was
5 days
5
after
days.
taking over.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And our team was well briefed. Everyone knew what their position was. No one was going to speak out of turn. No one was going to say things as it happened previously about what they thought was wrong with the organization. So we very clearly outlined who was responsible for saying what, and it would be people that had the knowledge. So there was the preparation. We had to make sure that all of our team was prepared to such a degree that any questions that were asked, they were able to answer. And we sat on from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening with this FAA team. 2 of them had been on the previous audit, including the lead auditor. And at 6 o'clock, the lead auditor asked to see me in my office. And I thought, wow, this sounds a bit ominous. And we went into my office, and he said, all right, I need to tell you a couple of things. He said, first of all, we went through all of your corrective action plans in Washington and discussed it with the Secretary for Transportation. And we felt that your CAA hadn't done enough to warrant retaining the Category 1 status. And in fact, we have a letter to that effect. Oh. And I mean, my heart just sank. My heart just absolutely sank. He said, but. I said, oh, okay.
There's a but.
There's a but. He said, based on what we've seen today and based on how this team has come together and with what you have identified as your shortcomings and the plans that you will put in place to make sure that you achieve everything, we in fact have changed our minds and we're going to recommend that you retain Category 1 status. You can imagine.
Yeah.
You can imagine. He said, but.
Another but.
Said, okay. Yeah. So he said, well, we're coming back in 6 months' time because we've done this before in countries, and we come back in 6 months' time and they've done nothing. So we're going to come back in 6 months' time. We're going to re-audit, and we want to make sure that you're good to your word. And I said, you have no worries and no concerns. We will make sure, my team and I will make sure that we achieve everything that we can, which was actually a tall order because we had to rewrite a number of acts.
Sure.
And writing an act in the law is quite something.
Yeah. Can I just pause you there for a second before you get into the meat of it? So quite a baptism of fire that week, and obviously all your wealth of knowledge at that point has been used well, entertaining and discussing through with these auditors that arrived. But in a sense, as you mentioned earlier, preparation, you've just created the playbook for what is, in a sense, the execution over the next 6 months and longer, but certainly for the next 6 months. So now this playbook, you're putting all that effort into it, now you need to deliver. So what were the kind of things, now you've mentioned like the acts, and now to zoom in on these things to get that sort of green light to go ahead in 6 months' time. Maybe just share a couple of the things that stood out for you at that time, executing from the playbook.
Right. So in an ICAO evaluation, there are 9 areas in which you are assessed. One of them being legislation. The other 8 are just as big, and you get marked on compliance. So there are the ICAO standards which are measured against. And all of the standards are applied to you as a Civil Aviation Authority. And if you comply with everything, you score 100%. If you comply with only 75%, you get scored at 75% in each of the 9 categories. So we had a metric of where we stood from the August 2007 audit, and we had a goal. And our goal was to comply 100% in all 9 areas of compliance.
Another lofty goal.
That was our goal.
This theme of 100% is coming through in your career over and over, Colin.
This is what the minister tasked us with doing, and it wasn't all going to happen within 6 months.
Sure.
But we had to put processes in place that would ensure, certainly within my 3-year tenure, that we would achieve these goals, and that it wouldn't only be things that we could do as a Civil Aviation Authority, but it would also be things like ICASA, which write regulations on radio communications that we had to change. So there were a lot of things that had to be done in various government departments and within industry as well. So that was our target, and so they came back within 7 months in July of 2008.
Yeah.
Same auditors. We had everything ready for them. They joined us at 9 o'clock again in the morning.
Yeah.
11 o'clock, the lead auditor said, "Can we see you in your office?" I said, "Sure." He said, "We're happy. 2 hours, we're happy."
Great.
We are absolutely convinced here that you will achieve everything. You've achieved a hell of a lot already, but you will achieve everything that you set yourselves to do, and that is to become 100% ICAO compliant.
Oh, great.
And of course we were overjoyed, absolutely overjoyed with that.
Oh, nice.
But
it must have been a mountain of work.
It was, and it continued. So when I left at the end of my tenure, at the end of 2010, we were 99.7% compliant.
Oh, wow. That's quite an
There's
achievement.
One item,
What was that one item? Can you remember?
there was one item. One item was ICASA.
Okay.
ICASA being communications, whatever it is of South Africa, not association.
Administration or something, the radio licensing
Administration,
people.
yeah. The radio licensing people, yeah. They still couldn't get the act together, and there was one thing outstanding. So, but that was really quite something for our team and for the people that worked for me at the CIA.
So tell me a little bit about the team there. So in terms of high performing teams, obviously normally they're led fairly well, but there's generally a big support team that goes on behind the scene. Explain a little bit about your team at CAA. Who was this team that helped grab this thing by the scruff of the neck, shake it up to 99.7% by the time of your end of your tenure there?
So one of the first things that I did is to restructure my team and bring in additional talent. So the two major departments are flight operations and airworthiness. And I had Oba Chakarisa in charge of airworthiness, and I brought in Anton Richmond, who was a former SAA pilot and also who was a vice president at SAA back in the days of Coleman Andrews. And I brought him in to head up the flight operations side of things. And they were essentially the two major characters in most of what the CIA does. Harvey Bespier headed up the air infrastructure side of things, which is responsible for looking at or responsible for air traffic control, the airports, the air structure. He chaired the National Airspace Committee. And then I had people in charge of security. So my general manager of security was Poppy Corzo, who is currently the director of civil aviation. And then obviously I had the usual financial people and HR and and implementation. Louise, and her name has just escaped, my surname escaped me for a second. She was in charge of implementation of our program. So she had to keep track of where we stood in terms of ICAO compliance. And so that was the basic team, and everyone got along and did the job that they were supposed to do, and I think we did it very successfully.
It sounds there's a common theme there. So when I was chatting with Gary Kirsten last week, he mentioned as well being put into a role, a very senior role, where a lot is expected of you. You want to handpick somebody that can sort of boost you, become a bit of a sounding board at the same time, but also free up your thinking so that you're not worried about all the bits and pieces. And it sounds like a couple of those early key appointments was certainly beneficial. But I want to ask you now, so this is obviously a great mammoth task, a nice high expectation of the team. We want to deliver the 100% on the findings in 9 areas, and no small feat. How do you know that through this process you start noticing some wins and maybe some losses along the way too? What do you notice when the team is really working in sync? What's sort of communication like? How is it? What are those times where you can tell that this team is firing on all cylinders and we're making progress?
Well, for us, I think it was on 2 sides. One is that we had the measurement of whether or not we had complied with addressing the findings. So once we'd addressed the findings, a particular finding, we sent that proposal through to ICAO. They said we're happy with that. Then we could tick that box. Okay. And so we were continuously ticking the boxes as and when we put in place regulations, we put in place systems, we put in place personnel, we put in place all of the stuff necessary to tick those boxes. We could see the progress. But that was the one aspect. The other aspect, and I think to me the more important aspect, was our interaction with industry. And civil aviation authorities around the world typically are very bureaucratic. And in fact, when I got to the CAA, at every air show, they used to put up this little dog kennel with this CAA written on the side of the roof, and people would go and flower bomb this thing as a show for the spectators, and that was the reputation of the CAA at the time. And I, having been in the industry side of it for so long, I wanted to change that concept. And we had airworthiness inspectors who some of who retired, even SA flight engineers or engineers or other companies. That had to do inspections on maintenance organizations, including SAA and Comair and all the big ones and the small ones. And the feedback from industry was that it was always a dread situation. Gee, the CA is coming. Are we going to fail? We're going to, what's going to happen to our license? And so at the time, we had, for even today, there's a system whereby if a particular organization is not able to comply with a regulation to the letter of the law, they can apply for an alternate means of compliance. So, for example, if you're required to have so many radios on your airplane, and they come up with, or as separate radios, they come up with a single radio, but which has got 3 separate radios built in. You can then apply to have this new radio put in as an alternate means of compliance.
Sure.
But when I got there, I had to do the final sign-off. And when I got there, every application for alternate means of compliance was being rejected. And the process was such that a team of 3 engineers or airworthiness guys would sit around the table, would look at the application, look at the motivation, and then turn it down. And eventually I started getting feedback that, what's going on here? And I called in this group of engineers. And first time they'd ever been in the boss's office, I believe, they told me. And I said, please explain to me your thought process here, because people are asking you for a variance to the regulation by showing alternate means of compliance, and you're just turning it down. Mm-hmm. So the response was, well, yes, it doesn't comply to the regulations. And we don't believe that what they put here is sufficient to achieve an equivalent level of safety. That's another buzzword that's used.
Okay.
So I said to them, all right, well, what I'm seeing is that you just reject it. How about you apply your minds together? You guys have got the experience. And guys, I use men and women as well. We had quite a few women in that department. You guys put your heads together, and why don't you advise the client to say, look, right now we're not quite happy with what you presented, but if you did A, B, C, and re-presented it to us, we might be able to recommend that this be passed.
Okay.
And they sort of looked at me as if, oh, gee, well, we've never done this before. So I said, wouldn't it be nice to have people thank you for the work you've done instead of swear at you?
Sure.
And they said, "Oh, maybe that's a good idea." And so I changed the thinking, and literally within a month, the whole thing changed. And I remember going to Wonderboom in Pretoria Airport to give a safety talk there to all of the people that operate out of Wonderboom, the maintenance organizations, training schools. And afterwards, the maintenance guys in particular came to me and they said, you cannot believe the difference it is having an audit now. In fact, having the auditors come in now, we look forward to it because they show us where we have shortcomings, and they assist us in getting it rectified, and what a pleasure. So that to me was even more satisfying than this 100% ICAO compliance. It was ensuring that we promoted aviation and civil aviation, and that we acted as an aid to growth of the industry.
Sure. Well, I mean,
as opposed to
Colin,
a hindrance.
It sounds like the sort of principle of Kaizen's come in full circle, because now that team is now allowing the individuals and the AMOs out there to see where they went wrong and improve. And everybody wants to just get better. And if someone's going to give you a playbook to say, this is how you get better, what better way of doing it? And the principle of Kaizen that went from SAA all those years ago through to the civil aviation, I think that's a great way to wrap it all up. We had so many more things to talk about, but I've used up so much of your time. And in the same principle of coming full circle, today's sponsor, Airline Leather, is very generously sending out a wallet to you too, Colin. All guests that come with on the sponsored episode receive one of these handcrafted artisanal wallets. So it's on its way. Colin, I thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful chatting with you, and I hope we have another conversation sometime in the future.
That would be great. Thank you, Alex, and cheers to everybody.
Thanks. Well, thank you everybody for joining the conversation today. It was a wonderful, engrossing conversation. Not a whole lot of media. I just got so involved in the stories, and certainly there's more to talk about. Please remember to subscribe and share, give your comments, ask your questions, and until next time, please stay safe.